Hello and welcome to Crash Course. Today we're going to be taking a look at the neurosensory system. Essentially, there are so many elements to the neurosensory system, and therefore today we're just going to be focusing on the basic principles underlying the nervous system and the anatomy of the nervous system as well. But to start with, let's start with a few questions to see what you already know, and as always, please do pause the video at this point to give yourself a chance to answer the questions, as these are bite-sized videos to allow it to be covered in under 15 minutes. So question 1. With regards to the cell body, what direction does the dendrite carry the impulse? Is it away from the cell body, towards the cell body, away from and towards the cell body, or around the cell body, so bypassing the cell body? So your answer here, of course, is B, towards the cell body. Dendrites bring information in towards the nucleus, which then passes out of the cell body via the axon towards the next axon terminal. And remember, your axons are what are surrounded by your myelin sheath and demonstrate saltatory conduction between the Schwann cells. Question 2. Think about the action potential. During repolarization, what happens? Is it a potassium slow influx, a potassium efflux, sodium rapid influx, or calcium efflux? So think about your normal action potential and how this includes a depolarization at threshold, repolarization followed by hyperpolarization, in other words the refractory period. In repolarization, of course, it's a potassium efflux, so potassium ions leave during repolarization and sodium ions enter during depolarization. Hyperpolarization is a state of refractory, in other words, no action potential can be generated, and this is due to the slow closing of potassium ion channels. Question 3. The parasympathetic nervous system keeps us alert and prepared for fight or flight response. Is this statement true or false? Essentially, of course, this statement is false, and the reason for this is that the sympathetic nervous system is what drives the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic is all about rest and digest. So basic principles of the nervous system then. It's a complex network of nerves and cells that simply carry messages to and from the brain and spinal cord to various other parts of the body. It sends signals along fibres, and we call these fibres axons, and these communicate with other cells by releasing neurotransmitters, chemicals, and these neurotransmitters are released at synapses, in other words cell-to-cell junctions. In humans, the nervous system consists of both a central aspect and a peripheral aspect. The central aspect is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral aspect is essentially all the other nervous tissue. The nervous system is an organ that coordinates either voluntary or involuntary actions that allows us to react to changing environments around us. So we can think about this in a more simplistic view. So we've got the nervous system, which can be divided centrally and peripherally, and as we've just said, the central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is made up of a sensory and motor aspect, of which motor can be further subdivided into somatic and autonomic nervous system. And from a previous question, we know that the autonomic nervous system is actually further subdivided into sympathetic and parasympathetic, our fight and flight versus our rest and digest systems. The nervous system essentially integrates three aspects. It has sensory input. It receives information from the environment via nerve impulses. It then integrates this information and coordinates a motor response to the effector, and we'll explore this in a little bit more detail later on. So first we're going to go through all the anatomy of the nervous system, and there's quite a lot of it. So let's start with the brain, right at the top of the nervous system. The brain can be subdivided into several different lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. And these regions all have different functions, which we'll explore again a little bit later on. The frontal lobe and parietal lobe can be separated by this central sulcus, which is a depression in the middle between the frontal and parietal lobe. If we take a look at the brain from a sagittal aspect, in other words, we take a look at the brain from the side, if you cut it in half, we have this corpus callosum in the centre. We also have a thalamus here, which is just above the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is of course connected to the pituitary gland via the infundibulum. Right at the back of the brain we've got this little brain, in other words our cerebellum, and this part here, just down the middle, is the brain stem. So you've got the brain stem, the cerebellum, and the brain, in other words the cerebral cortex. The corpus callosum essentially connects our two hemispheres, so the two hemispheres are our left and our right aspects of the brain, and the corpus callosum is a bundle of nerve fibres that connects the two. The thalamus is our key relay station, so any information that's entering the brain from the peripheries is divided up to the different cortexes relevant to where it needs to go, and the thalamus decides this when the impulse arrives at the brain and projects it to the correct cerebral cortex. Next we have the brainstem. So as I've said, the brainstem is this little bit down here, and the brainstem is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Next, of course, we come to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord can be split depending on the region of the spinal cord. Right at the top we have the cervical spinal cord, and this is made up of 7 cervical vertebrae and 8 cervical nerves. And the reason there are more nerves than vertebrae essentially is because of the location of where C1 exits the spinal cord. It exits just above the C1 vertebra, and therefore this results in there being more nerves than vertebrae in this region. Everywhere else is fairly self-explanatory. You have the thoracic region, where there's 12 vertebrae and 12 nerves. You have the lumbar region, with 5 nerves and 5 vertebrae. Then we have the sacral region, with 5 vertebrae and 5 nerves. And last of all, we have this coccygeal area, which is also a little bit of an anomaly, in respect you've got 4 fused coccygeal vertebrae in this almost triangle shape, and just 1 coccygeal nerve. And the reason behind this, of course, is that the spinal cord has ended around L1, L2 region, and is just continued as this chorda equina down the conus medullaris. Next we can take a cross-section of the spinal cord, and essentially we should know that this is white matter and this is grey matter. The difference between these is that white matter carries myelinated fibres, and the grey matter contains the cell nuclei. This is the central canal running down the middle, and the 2 slits at the top and bottom are the anterior median sulcus and the posterior median sulcus. Of course, what's really important here is that the posterior median sulcus, in other words at the back of the spinal cord, is where the dorsal horn arises as well. So dorsal is another word for posterior or at the back. And then at the front we've got this anterior or ventral horn, in other words something that's at the front of the spinal cord. So another thing to note is that as we decrease down the levels of the spinal cord from around the cervical region to the sacral region, for example, in the cervical region we have a high proportion of white matter to grey matter, and as we reach the sacral region it's actually the other way around, so we've got a higher portion of grey matter in comparison to white matter. This is exactly the same photo, just in a little bit more detail. So white matter, grey matter again, as we've pointed out. This is the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, and this is the dorsal root ganglion. This is the ventral root at the front, and what's really important about this is the signal that's coming in. Signals always are inputted through this dorsal root. So the dorsal root is sensory, and the ventral root is motor. In other words, it's an outgoing signal. And this is a really important thing to distinguish. So the dorsal root, the aspect at the posterior of the spinal cord, is the incoming sensory signal, bringing information to the central nervous system from the peripheries, and then you've got this outgoing signal, this motor signal through the ventral region, which is carrying the impulse to the effector. Next we have a spinal reflex arc, and this is really exactly the same thing, showing that the sensory information comes in through this dorsal root, synapses in the dorsal root ganglion where the cell body is, passed on to this relay neuron, and then straight out via the ventral root, the motor neuron carries the information to the effector. And this is a simple reflex arc where, for example, say a stimulus occurs, so this may be pain to the skin, and you want to move your hand away as quickly as possible, or you want to move yourself away from the stimulus as quickly as possible, and therefore you'd get this reflex arc, this quick movement. Anatomy of the tracts, I'm not going to cover this in great detail here because it does have a section all of its own, but what's really important is the difference in this diagram and what really happens in real life. So in real life, motor and sensory are of course on both sides of the spinal cord, and this diagram is clearly to show you just the difference between motor and spinal in the positions, to make it a little bit less confusing. First, let's have a look at the sensory aspect, and this mainly is the dorsal column made up of the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. There's also the spinocerebellar tract, of course, which goes to the cerebellum. We've got the spinothalamic tract as well. In terms of the motor aspect, we've got the corticospinal tract, and there's the lateral aspect of this, as well as the ventral aspect. And we've also got the extrapyramidal tracts, the rubrispinal tract, the reticulospinal tract as well. And like I say, these will be covered in a later aspect of one of these videos. Just to really re-emphasize this, on the left-hand side here we can see the sensory aspects of the tracts, and on the right hand side we can see the motor aspects, and the sensory aspects are the ascending parts and the descending ones are the motor aspects. Next we have the cranial nerves on the underside of the brain, and of course there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. First we have the olfactory nerve, followed by the optic nerve, and this is where the optic chiasm is. Then we have the oculomotor, followed by trochlea. Then there are the 3 branches of the trigeminal nerve. Then following this we've got the abducent, the facial, the vestibulocochlear, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, the accessory, and lastly the hypoglossal nerve. And it's really important that you know the positions of all these nerves on the brain. as well as their function, which will be covered in a later video. Next we have the meninges, and this essentially is what surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. So this is taking a section of the brain to have a look at, and this of course is the skin, followed by the periosteum and the skull. And then we have the 3 layers of the meninges. So the dura mater is the most outer layer, the tough fibrous layer. Then we have the arachnoid matter, followed by the pia mater on the inside. And this area within the middle here is the superior sagittal sinus. And this is where the cerebrospinal fluid, which is circulating within the ventricles of the brain, will eventually drain to. Next we have the circle of Willis. So it's really important to be aware of the arterial and venous supply of the brain. So the circle of Willis exists on the underside of the brain as well. And essentially it's made up of an anterior and a posterior system. So the anterior system is made up of the internal carotid artery, and the posterior system is made up of the vertebro-basilar system, so from the vertebral artery from the subclavian and from the basilar artery here. And the basilar artery has several branches which gives off the pontine branches, but most importantly of these 2 branches at the top. So this one here is a superior cerebellar artery, which kind of couples up to go to the cerebellum with this inferior cerebellar artery from the vertebral artery. But the 3 branches we really need to know about are the posterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, and the anterior cerebral artery. And the reason these are so important is they're going to go on to supply the different parts of the brain, and it's really important to know which part they supply. Then we've got the internal carotid, and we've got posterior communicating arteries and anterior communicating arteries. But as I've said, the main 3 to know about are these anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries, where they arise from and where they're going to. This diagram nicely summarises where each of these arteries go to, and therefore what they supply, and therefore what there'd be a problem with if one of these arteries became occluded, for example, in a stroke. Next we have the ventricular system of the brain, and essentially the ventricular system is made up of 4 ventricles. We've got 2 lateral ventricles, a third ventricle, and a 4th ventricle as well. And cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the choroid plexus in all ventricles, so it's made by the choroid plexus. But first of all, let's start at the lateral ventricles. So CSF is produced in the floor of the lateral ventricles by this choroid plexus. It then passes through the foramen of Monro down into the roof of the 3rd ventricle. Following this, it goes through the aqueduct of Sylvius down to the 4th ventricle here in this diamond shape in front of the cerebellum. And then it can either go through the foramen of Magendie or the foramen of Luschka out to the subarachnoid space and the arachnoid granulations. And as we've said, eventually it will be recycled back up into the superior sagittal sinus in the brain. So just to give these a little bit of labelling, so this is the lateral ventricle, so the 2 lateral ventricles. You can only see really 1 here, but you can see 1, 2 here. Then we've got the 3rd ventricle, which is where it passes to next through the foramen of Monro, and then we're going down to the 4th ventricle through the aqueduct of Sylvius, which sits in a diamond shape just in front of the cerebellum. Lastly, for this video, we'll just take a quick look at the anatomy of the venous drainage. Essentially, the ones to know about are the superior sagittal sinus, which runs along the superior aspect of the brain. Then we've got this transverse sinus at the back, and this sigmoid sinus down below. Other ones to be aware of are the Sylvian vein, so this is a superficial middle cerebral vein, and down here this is a sphenoparietal sinus. The dural venous sinus is essentially what drain the brain, and it's a network of veins which work to all drain to a confluence of sinuses before draining back to the heart. Just to put this in a more simple, wordy form, for those of you who learn that way, so the brain will drain to the superior sagittal sinus, draining to the confluence of sinuses. From the eye will go to the cavernous sinus, to the superior petrosal sinus, and the inferior petrosal sinus. So this isn't particularly important for you to know right now, but what's really important is the confluence of sinuses joins with the inferior petrosal sinus to form the transverse sinus, which then goes to the sigmoid sinus and goes to the internal jugular vein, which is its way back to the brachiocephalic trunk and the right atrium through the superior vena cava. Essentially, this side of the anatomy is not as important, but it allows you to appreciate what forms the transverse sinus and so on. Also be aware that going into your brachiocephalic trunks, you've also got your subclavians from the right and left, and going into your subclavians, of course, you've got your external jugular vein, so that's where your external and internal jugular vein comes from. Knowing this in a word format then allows you to apply it to the diagram when you see it. That's everything for this video. If you do have any feedback, please do let me know, and I hope you found it useful. Thank you for listening.